The testimonies featured on this channel are presented as received, reflecting the personal experiences and perspectives of the individuals who have generously shared them with us. We encourage our viewers to approach these testimonies with compassion and understanding as they represent the personal journeys of those involved. Thank you for your understanding and patience. Today's experience is shared with us by a sister from Nigeria, Amina Balla, who was one of the 276 girls abducted by Nigeria's Islamist terror group Boko Haram on April 14, 2014, from Government Girls Secondary School in Chibok, Borno State, in the northeastern part of Nigeria, while they were preparing for their final exams. She was taken from everything she knew and thrust into a world of unimaginable darkness. But even in the shadows, her faith, hope, and trust in God burned like a flickering candle, refusing to be snuffed out. This is not just a story of tragedy, but one of survival, resilience, and an unshakable belief in the power of hope. It's a story that will break your heart, yet mend it at the same time. This is the journey of Amina Balla, a journey of tears, courage, and triumph over unspeakable odds. Endeavor to watch until the end to fully understand her experience. Trust me, this is a story you don't want to miss. Now let's listen to Amina.
My name is Amina Balla. I am from Chibok, a small town in Borno State, in the northeastern part of Nigeria. When I think about my life before everything changed, my heart feels heavy. Sometimes I wish I could go back to those peaceful days, even for just a moment. I was 16 years old then. I loved school, especially reading and writing. My dream was to become a lawyer, to fight for people who couldn't speak for themselves. My late father always encouraged me, saying, "Amina, you will bring light to this world. Never give up on your dreams." My father was a pastor, a man full of faith and love, but my life wasn't easy. I was an orphan. The Islamic terrorist group Boko Haram had taken everything from me, my father, my mother, and my 2 little brothers. They were killed during an attack on our village when I was just 13 years old. I still remember that night, the sound of gunshots, the screams, the smell of smoke. I hid under my bed trembling, praying to Jesus to save me. When it was over, I was the only one left alive. My family was gone. After that night, I went to live with my uncle. He tried his best to take care of me, but life was hard for everyone in Chibok. We lived in fear. Boko Haram had been attacking villages, burning churches, and kidnapping people for years, but somehow I still had hope. I prayed every day and believed that God had a plan for me. School was my safe place. It was where I felt normal again, even though the world around me was anything but normal. I loved sitting in the classroom, listening to my teachers and joking with my friends. My best friend Layla was like a sister to me. We often talked about our dreams and promised each other that we would leave Chibok one day to chase a better life. As the final exams approached, we were all nervous but excited. Passing those exams meant a chance at a brighter future. I remember the night of April 14th, 2014, so clearly. It was the night before our first paper. We were in the dormitory, studying and laughing, trying to calm our nerves. That night started like any other. The dormitory was filled with the hum of girls whispering, flipping through books, and laughing softly. I remember sitting on my bunk bed with Layla, trying to memorize formulas for our exams. She joked about how she would rather marry a prince than solve another math problem. We laughed, not knowing how much our lives were about to change. Suddenly, we heard it, the sharp, cracking sound of gunfire in the distance. At first, we froze. Maybe it was a drill, I thought, or perhaps soldiers were chasing wild animals in the bush. But then came the shouting, loud, angry voices, in a language I didn't understand. "Get down! Turn off the lights!" one of the older girls whispered urgently. Panic swept through the dormitory. The younger girls began to cry, their small voices trembling in fear. Layla grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. "Amina, what's happening?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding. The sounds grew louder, gunshots, footsteps, shouting. Suddenly the door burst open, and men with guns stormed in. They wore military uniforms, but their faces were covered. One of them yelled in Hausa, saying, "You girls, get up! Move now!" Hausa is the general language spoken in northern Nigeria. We were too scared to move. Some girls screamed. Others clung to each other, frozen in fear. The man fired his gun into the air, and the sound echoed through the room. "Now!" he barked. We were herded out of the dormitory like cattle. I tried to grab my Bible from under my pillow, but the man shoved me forward. "Leave it," he growled. Outside, the air was thick with smoke. The school was on fire, flames devouring the classrooms, the library, everything. My legs felt weak as I stumbled across the schoolyard, clutching Layla's hand. Girls were crying, begging the men to let them go. One of the men laughed and said, "Western education is haram. You should thank us for saving you." We were forced onto trucks, packed so tightly that it was hard to breathe. Some girls tried to run, but the men caught them and beat them mercilessly. I looked at Layla, and she looked at me. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she whispered, "Amina, we'll be okay. God is with us." The truck roared to life, and we began the journey into darkness. The road was bumpy, and the forest around us seemed to close in. I heard some girls whispering prayers, others sobbing quietly. At one point, a few brave girls jumped off the truck, disappearing into the night. I wanted to follow them, but fear held me back. What if I broke my leg? What if I got lost? What if they found me? Layla grabbed my arm. "Don't even think about it," she whispered. "They'll kill us if we try." So I stayed. The journey felt like forever. My body ached from the cramped position, and my mind was racing. Where were they taking us? What would they do to us? Would I ever see my uncle again? Eventually, the truck stopped. The men shouted for us to get down. My legs wobbled as I stepped onto the dirt. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and something else I couldn't place, something rotten. We were in the middle of the Sambisa forest, deep in Boko Haram's territory. When we arrived, it felt like we had stepped into another world, a dark, cruel world. The forest was thick and suffocating, the air heavy with humidity and the cries of insects. Dim fires flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows on makeshift tents and mud huts. Armed men stood everywhere, their faces hard and emotionless. "Get down! Stand in a line!" one of them barked. We scrambled out of the trucks, trembling and unsure of what to do. The girls around me clung to each other, some sobbing quietly, others staring blankly at the ground as if their spirits had already left them. Then he appeared, the man they called the commander. His name was Abubakar Shekau. He was tall and intimidating, with a long beard and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through us. He stood before us with a rifle slung over his shoulder and began to speak in a booming voice. "You are now in the hands of Boko Haram," he said, pacing back and forth. "Western education is haram. It is forbidden. You have been poisoned by it, but we will save you." His words sent chills down my spine. He spoke about how education was a sin, how girls like us were meant to serve men and obey, not fill our heads with knowledge. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You will all convert to Islam," he declared. "This is your salvation. If you refuse, you will die." The girls around me gasped. their fear turning into panic. I could feel Layla trembling beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. The commander raised his hand, and the men around him began shouting, "Allahu Akbar!" The sound echoed through the forest, a haunting chorus that seemed to swallow all hope. One of the younger girls, barely more than 13, fell to her knees and cried out, "Please, let me go home. I'll do anything." The commander walked over to her and smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Your home is here now," he said. "You belong to us." They separated us into groups, forcing us into different huts. I was shoved into a dark, cramped space with Layla and a few other girls. The air inside was stifling, and the floor was nothing but cold, hard dirt. "We have to pray," Layla whispered as soon as the door was shut. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We knelt on the ground, clutching each other's hands, and whispered prayers to God. I kept repeating Psalm 23 in my mind. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The words gave me a small flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished when the door burst open, and a man threw a sack of stale bread at us. "Eat," he growled. We ate in silence, each bite feeling like sand in my mouth. Outside, I could hear the men laughing, talking about raids and operations. That night, as we lay on the cold floor, I couldn't sleep. The faces of my late parents, my late siblings, and my uncle flashed in my mind. I wondered if my uncle and his family were thinking of me, if they were praying for me. In the darkness, Layla whispered, "Amina, do you think we'll ever get out of here?" I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if we would survive, but I couldn't let her lose hope. "Yes," I said finally. "God is with us. He'll find a way." Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Life in Sambisa Forest was a nightmare that refused to end. Every morning, we woke up to the sound of gunshots and shouts, a reminder that we were prisoners in the hands of men who had no mercy. The huts where we slept were cramped and filthy. We were given scraps of food, mostly dried yams or watery porridge, and barely enough water to survive. Some of the girls fell ill, their bodies too weak to fight off sickness. The men didn't care. "If they die, they die," one of them said coldly. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the sickness. It was the constant fear. Every day, the Boko Haram commander would gather us in the clearing and remind us of his power. "You are no longer who you were," he said one day, his voice filled with anger. "You are now daughters of Boko Haram. Forget your old lives. Forget your God. From now on, you obey us." Then came the mock executions. They would drag girls out of the huts, blindfold them, and force them to kneel in the dirt. The men would fire their guns into the air, laughing as the girls screamed and begged for their lives. I can't count how many times I thought I was going to die. But in those moments, I held on to my faith with everything I had. Whenever I could, I whispered prayers under my breath, quoting scriptures that gave me strength. I would always repeat Psalm 46:1, which says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." One day, Layla and I were pulled from our hut and taken to the clearing. The commander stood before us, flanked by armed men. "You two are stubborn," he said, glaring at us. "You refuse to convert, refuse to submit. Do you think your God will save you?" I didn't answer. I was too afraid to speak, but in my heart, I cried out to Jesus. He raised his gun and pointed it at me. "Say the Shahada and become a Muslim, or you die." Tears streamed down my face, but I shook my head. Layla was trembling beside me, her hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. The commander laughed. "You have courage, I'll give you that, but courage won't save you." Instead of shooting us, he ordered his men to beat us. They dragged us back to the hut, bloodied and bruised, but still alive. That night, as we lay on the dirt floor, Layla whispered, "Do you think he's still with us?" I turned to her, my voice shaking but firm. "Yes, even in this darkness, he's with us. He hasn't left. God is always with us." It wasn't long before they started marrying off the girls. One by one, we were called out of the huts and told we were now wives. There was no choice, no escape. When they called my name, I felt my heart shatter. The man I was forced to marry was one of the commanders, a cruel and angry man named Ibrahim. He barely spoke to me except to give orders. I was nothing more than property to him. The first time he touched me, I wanted to die. I cried for days afterward, my body and soul feeling broken beyond repair. But even in those moments, I prayed. I asked God to give me strength, to help me endure. When I discovered I was pregnant, I felt both fear and hope. Fear because I was bringing a child into this nightmare, and hope because maybe, just maybe, this child would give me a reason to keep going. My son was born on a cold night in the forest. I named him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Holding him in my arms, I felt a love so fierce it almost broke me. But I also felt guilt. How could I love a child born from such pain? 2 years later, Ibrahim was killed during a raid by the Nigerian army. I thought his death would bring me freedom, but it didn't. The commander quickly remarried me to another man, a younger fighter named Musa. He was no kinder than Ibrahim. By the time I had my second son, I was numb to the pain. Every day was a battle to survive, to hold on to my faith, to remind myself that this wasn't the end. Layla and I often whispered to each other at night, planning our escape. "We have to try," she said one night, her voice filled with desperation. "If we stay here, we'll die. If we leave, at least we have a chance." I looked at my sons, sleeping peacefully beside me. My heart ached at the thought of leaving them behind, but I knew Layla was right. If we didn't escape, we would never be free. We began gathering what little we could, bits of food, scraps of cloth, and we prayed. Every night, we prayed for courage, for guidance, for a miracle. And then, one dark and silent night, we ran. The night we escaped was one of the darkest and coldest nights I had ever experienced in Sambisa. Layla and I had waited for weeks, studying the guards' routines, memorizing the paths through the forest, and praying for the right moment. That moment came when a heavy rainstorm swept through the camp. The rain drowned out the noise of our movements, and the guards huddled under makeshift shelters, trying to keep dry. It was now or never. "Are you ready?" Layla whispered, clutching my hand tightly. I nodded, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure someone would hear it. "Let's go." We slipped out of the hut, moving as silently as shadows. The forest was pitch black, the thick canopy above blocking out the moonlight. Every step felt like an eternity, every rustle of leaves a threat. We didn't dare speak. We communicated with hand signals, our breaths shallow and quick. The wet ground squelched beneath our bare feet, and the rain soaked us to the bone, but we kept moving. Suddenly, a voice shouted in the distance, "Where are they?" My heart sank. They had discovered our absence. "Run!" Layla hissed, pulling me forward. We sprinted through the forest, branches slashing at our arms and legs. Behind us, we could hear shouts and the sound of footsteps growing closer. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. "God, please help us. Protect us. Guide us," I whispered under my breath. over and over again. After what felt like hours, the shouts began to fade. We slowed down, gasping for air, our bodies trembling from fear and exhaustion. "Do you think they're still following us?" Layla asked, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, but I couldn't be sure. "We can't stop. Not yet." For days, we wandered through the forest, surviving on roots, leaves, and rainwater. We took turns keeping watch at night, our ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The forest was alive with the cries of animals, the rustle of leaves, and the howls of the wind. Every morning, we knelt together to pray. We would repeatedly recite Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." Those words gave us strength, reminding us that even in the depths of darkness, we were not alone. On the 5th day, we ran out of food. Hunger gnawed at our stomachs, and our bodies grew weaker with each passing hour. "I can't go on," Layla said one evening, collapsing to the ground. "You have to," I said, pulling her up. "We didn't come this far to give up now. God didn't bring us this far to leave us." On the 7th day, just as the sun was setting, we saw him, a hunter, walking through the forest with a rifle slung over his shoulder. At first, we were terrified. Was he one of them? But when he saw us, his face softened with concern. "Who are you?" he asked in Hausa. "We are from Chibok," I said, my voice trembling. "We were taken by Boko Haram. We escaped." The hunter's eyes widened, and he nodded. "You're safe now," he said. "Come with me." He led us to his small village, where the people welcomed us with open arms. They gave us food, water, and a place to rest. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. The hunter contacted the authorities, and within days, we were reunited with our families. When I saw my uncle, I broke down in tears, falling into his arms. "Amina, you're alive," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank God, you're alive." But even as I hugged him, my heart ached for the children I had left behind in Sambisa. I prayed that one day I would see them again. Returning to Chibok was bittersweet. The familiar faces, the warm embrace of my uncle, and the overwhelming joy of freedom were like a dream. But the memories of Sambisa Forest haunted me. The smiles of the people in Chibok were mixed with sorrow. They knew I wasn't the same Amina who had left years ago. My uncle, who had always been a strong man, now seemed frail as he looked at me. "Amina, I prayed every day for you," he said, his voice breaking. "I prayed too, Uncle," I replied, tears streaming down my face. "And God heard us." The nights were the hardest. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the screams of the other girls and the sound of gunfire still echoing in my mind. My uncle tried his best to comfort me, but some wounds went too deep to heal quickly. A few weeks after my return, representatives from a non-governmental organization visited our home. They had heard of my escape and were moved by my story. "Amina," one of them said gently, "we want to help you and other survivors rebuild your lives. We have partnered with schools in the United States to offer scholarships. Would you like to continue your education there?" The idea of leaving home again terrified me, but I thought of my parents, my siblings, and the dreams they had for me. I thought of Layla, who stood by my side in Sambisa, and the other girls who hadn't made it out. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I want to go." Layla, who had also escaped with me, was offered the same opportunity. We were both excited and scared, knowing this would be a completely new chapter of our lives. The day we left for America was filled with mixed emotions. The community gathered to pray for us, their voices raised in a hymn of thanksgiving. My uncle hugged me tightly at the airport, whispering, Go and shine, Amina. Let the world see the light of Christ in you. With Layla by my side, I boarded the plane. As it lifted off, I whispered a prayer. Father, guide me. Help me to honor you in this new journey. Landing in the United States felt like stepping into another world. The streets were wide, the buildings tall, and everything seemed to move so fast. Layla and I were assigned to different host families, and saying goodbye to her at the airport was harder than I imagined. You're my sister, she said, hugging me tightly. No matter where we are, we'll always have each other. Her words gave me strength as I followed my host family home. The Smiths, my host family, were kind and welcoming. Mrs. Smith, a soft-spoken woman with a warm smile, hugged me as if I were her own daughter. Amina, she said, we're so glad you're here. This is your home now. Their house was nothing like anything I had ever seen. There was a room just for me, with soft blankets, books, and a desk. At first, I found it hard to sleep in such comfort. My mind kept drifting back to Sambisa, to the hard ground and the cries of the other girls. Starting school was another challenge. The other students were friendly, but their world was so different from mine. They spoke quickly, used words I didn't understand, and asked me questions I wasn't ready to answer. Where are you from? One girl asked during lunch. Nigeria, I said simply, hoping she wouldn't press further. But not everyone was so kind. Some students whispered behind my back, pointing and laughing at my accent or the way I struggled to use a fork and knife. It hurt, but I reminded myself why I was here. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I whispered words from Psalm 28:7 to myself. The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusts in him, and I am helped. Mrs. Smith noticed my struggles and encouraged me. Amina, she said one evening, you have been through so much, but you're here for a reason. Don't let fear hold you back. You're stronger than you know. Her words stayed with me. Slowly, I began to adjust. I worked hard in school, staying late to study and asking for help when I didn't understand something. My teachers noticed my determination and supported me every step of the way. 2 years later, I stood on the stage during the high school graduation ceremony. My name was called, and the crowd erupted in applause. I was one of the top students, and the principal spoke about my resilience and hard work. As I received my diploma, I looked at the Smiths sitting in the audience, their faces beaming with pride. I thought of my uncle, my parents, and the girls who hadn't made it out of Sambisa. This is for them, I whispered. After the ceremony, I received more incredible news. I had been offered a full scholarship to study law at a prestigious university in the United States. It felt like a dream, but I knew it was the next step in my journey. Starting university was both exciting and intimidating. The campus was massive, filled with students from all over the world. Everyone seemed confident, walking briskly to their classes with books in hand. I, on the other hand, felt small and unsure, like I didn't belong. But I reminded myself of why I was here. God's comforting words from Jeremiah 29:11 kept echoing in my head. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." My host family, the Smiths, had been my greatest cheerleaders. They helped me settle into my dorm, bought me supplies, and prayed with me before leaving. Mrs. Smith held my hand tightly before saying goodbye. Amina, don't let anyone dim your light. You've come this far by God's grace, and He will carry you the rest of the way. University life was challenging at first. The classes were intense, and I struggled to keep up with the fast-paced lectures. My accent and limited vocabulary made it difficult to participate in discussions. Some students were kind, but others were dismissive, assuming I didn't belong because of where I came from. One day, during a class debate, a student sneered, "What does she even know about law? She's probably never even seen a courtroom." His words stung, but they also fueled my determination. I spent long hours in the library, reading everything I could and practicing my speaking skills. I knew I had a story to tell, a reason for being here, and I wasn't going to let anyone silence me. Slowly, I began to find my place. I joined a Christian fellowship group on campus, where I met other students who shared my faith. They welcomed me with open arms, encouraging me to share my story. One evening, during a group meeting, I stood up to speak. My voice trembled at first, but as I began to share my journey, from the horrors of Sambisa Forest to the miracle of my escape, silence fell over the room. "I shouldn't be here today," I said, tears streaming down my face. But God had a plan for me. Even in the darkest moments, He never left me, and I'm standing here because of His grace. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. People came up to me, thanking me for sharing and telling me how inspired they were. For the first time, I realized that my pain had a purpose. As the semesters passed, I excelled in my studies. I focused on human rights law, driven by my experiences and a deep desire to advocate for girls like me, those who had been silenced, oppressed, and forgotten. During my second year, I was invited to speak at a global conference on girls' education. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of hundreds, I felt a mix of fear and gratitude. "I am Amina Balla," I began, "a survivor of terror, a witness to God's grace, and a voice for those who cannot speak. God and education saved my life, and it is the key to saving many others." My speech was met with a standing ovation, and afterward, people approached me with tears in their eyes, telling me how much my story had moved them. One of the most significant moments of my university journey came when I graduated with honors. As I walked across the stage to receive my degree, I thought about everything it had taken to get here. The nights in Sambisa, the prayers whispered in the dark, the faith that had carried me through. When my name was announced, I looked up and whispered, "Thank you, Jesus." After graduation, I returned to Nigeria briefly, visiting Chibok and reconnecting with my uncle. The village had changed, many of the houses had been rebuilt, and there was a cautious sense of hope in the air. I shared my story with the community, encouraging the young girls to pursue their dreams despite the challenges they faced. I spoke in churches, schools, and community centers, emphasizing the importance of education and faith. "Your circumstances do not define you," I told them. "God can turn your pain into purpose." Back in the United States, I began working with international organizations focused on human rights and education. I traveled to refugee camps, war-torn regions, and impoverished communities, advocating for girls' education and speaking out against terrorism and violence. I also started a foundation in honor of my parents and siblings, providing scholarships to girls from conflict-affected areas. Every time I met a girl who reminded me of myself, I saw a spark of hope in their eyes, and I knew that my journey had meaning. After years of studying, growing, and serving, I found my true calling, the mission that God had prepared for me long before I even understood it. It became clear that my education, my story, and my experience in both the darkness of Sambisa and the light of freedom were not meant to stay within me. They were meant to be shared, to ignite hope in others, and to bring lasting change. It started with small conversations. Wherever I went, people wanted to know more, How did I survive? How did I hold on to my faith? How did I rise from the ashes of tragedy? And with every question, I felt a deep responsibility to give an honest and authentic answer. I didn't just want to speak about the pain I had endured. I wanted to speak about the victory that had followed, the victory that I knew only came through Christ. I found purpose in sharing my story to remind others that no matter what circumstances life throws their way, they can still rise, they can still dream, and they can still find hope. One evening, I was invited to speak at a youth conference held in a church in a nearby city. The room was filled with hundreds of young people, eager to hear stories of resilience and faith. I stood on that stage, my heart pounding with anticipation. I had prepared something that wasn't just a speech, but a message straight from my heart. I shared my life. I spoke about Chibok, about the abduction, about Sambisa, and about the journey to freedom. I spoke about the atrocities and the heartache, but I also spoke about God's unwavering presence. I shared my personal struggles, my doubts, and how, even when all seemed lost, I found strength in Him. I spoke about my secret prayers in the dark, about how Psalm 23 had brought me peace when everything around me was falling apart. Even in the valley of the shadow of death, God was with me, I told them, my voice trembling with emotion. He never left me, and He won't leave you either. The audience sat in silence, hanging on every word. When I finally finished, people began to clap, softly at first, but then louder until the entire room erupted in praise. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. I saw young girls leaning into their friends, as if my story had ignited something deep within them. Afterward, a young man approached me. His eyes were filled with both admiration and pain. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've given me something I've been searching for, hope." That night, I realized something. This wasn't just about speaking. This was about leading. This was about showing others that there's life after tragedy, and that every step, no matter how difficult, can be taken with faith. Inspired by that moment, I began to dedicate more of my time to speaking engagements, conferences, and community programs. Wherever I was invited, I went. I didn't care about how far the journey was, because I knew there was someone out there, someone who needed to hear my story, someone who needed to know that they weren't alone. One of the most impactful places I visited was a refugee camp near the border of Nigeria. It was filled with young girls, many similar to me, with their hopes and dreams crushed by violence. They had lost family members, friends, and were now living in fear, wondering if they would ever see peace again. As I walked through the camp, I saw the pain in their eyes. I recognized it. I could feel it in my bones. But I also saw hope, small sparks in their hearts, flickers of a dream they hadn't given up on yet. That's when I knew why I had been given this mission, to inspire them, to show them that even though their circumstances seemed dire, their stories weren't over yet. One afternoon, I held a session with the girls at the camp. We gathered under a makeshift tent, and as I began to speak, their eyes widened, listening intently. I told them about my experiences, the abduction, the captivity, the pain, but I also spoke about the triumph, about the victory God had given me. "The road won't always be easy," I said, "but God will always guide you. He will lead you when you feel lost. Trust in Him." When I finished, there was silence. And then one by one, the girls began to open up. They told me their stories of losing their families, of the fear they lived with every day, of the loss of hope. But what struck me most was the yearning in their voices. They wanted more than just to survive. They wanted to thrive. That day, I made a promise to them that I would fight for their education, their safety, and their future. I didn't just want to empower them. I wanted to give them tools, opportunities that could help them break free from the chains of oppression. That's when I decided to use my voice to raise awareness about girl-child education, particularly in conflict areas, and to call for greater international support. One of the biggest moments in my mission came when I spoke before a gathering of global leaders, UN officials, policymakers, and human rights advocates. It was a room filled with influence, power, and resources. I knew that what I said had the potential to move them to action. Enough is enough, I declared. We cannot allow the girls of my country, who have already endured so much, to be denied the right to education. Every girl deserves to be educated, no matter where she comes from. The room fell silent. Some leaders nodded in agreement, while others seemed skeptical, but I continued. My story is one of millions, I said. There are girls in Sambisa right now, still living in fear, still being denied the chance to learn. They need our voices, our action, and our unwavering support. Afterward, several organizations approached me, wanting to collaborate to help amplify the work I had started. It felt like a small victory, but it was only the beginning. Years passed, and my mission grew. I became deeply involved in advocating for girls' education and human rights. I partnered with local NGOs in Nigeria, traveling to remote villages, holding workshops, and creating educational programs. I worked alongside teachers, counselors, and community leaders, helping to create safe spaces where girls could learn without fear of persecution. And through it all, I carried the memory of my family, their faces, their voices, their faith. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Every step I took in my journey was a tribute to their lives, a testament to the power of hope and resilience. Looking back, I see the thread that connects every part of my life, the pain, the struggle, the moments of doubt, and the moments of triumph. It has all led me here, to this place of purpose, to this calling that has reshaped my life. My story isn't just about me. It's about hope. It's about faith. And it's about the unyielding strength that comes when we trust in God, even in the darkest times. I've seen what happens when faith is put into action, when hope isn't just something we speak about, but something we live. I've witnessed the lives that have been changed, the dreams that have been reignited, and the young girls who now see education not as a luxury, but as a path to freedom. And so, I will continue to speak, to act, and to move, because this isn't the end of my story. It's the beginning. And I know that God will guide me, just as He has always done, toward the greater mission He has set before me. Just as His words in Jeremiah 29:11 say, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This is my mission. And with God, I will continue to walk in it, bringing light to darkness, hope to despair, and love to those who have been forgotten. Today, I look back on my life with gratitude. The road has been long and painful, but it has also been filled with miracles and blessings. I often think of the girls who didn't make it out of Sambisa, of Layla and the bond we shared, of the Smiths and their kindness, and of my uncle, whose prayers kept me going. My story is not just mine. It belongs to every girl who has faced fear and overcome it, to every believer who has held onto faith in the darkest times, and to every person who dares to dream of a better world. As I stand before crowds sharing my journey, I always end with these words from Psalm 23, verse 1 to 3. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. My name is Amina Balla, and this is my story, a story of faith, resilience, and the unshakable power of hope.